My name is Dr. Demetria Rougeau-Shabazz, and I teach communications, media, and film. And today I'm here to talk to you about podcasting. So we're going to talk about how do you begin to create a podcast. And since, right now, a lot of folks are Zooming due to the quarantine and the pandemic, podcasting has become a bit more easy to do using Zoom or perhaps your smartphones. I just want to kind of lay out what we're going to look at in this introduction to podcasting, because we could get into the weeds and I'm going to try to streamline it for you. First off, we're going to talk about what is podcasting. Most of us have heard of podcasts, but I just want to make sure that we're kind of all speaking the same language and we're all on the same page. And then why would you choose to do a podcast or produce a podcast? And then third, I want to give you some examples of some of my favorite podcasts. So that maybe you'll explore, you'll listen to them for, examples of production values, content, that type of thing. And then we'll look at what's needed for you to produce your own podcast. And I'm going to try to give you kind of like the lower end of, anyone can do a podcast, which is one of the great things about it. And then if you're really into it, maybe you'd like to bump it up a notch and produce your podcast with some other types of equipment. And then lastly, we're going to look at hosting sites. So when you produce your podcast, you will have to have a place in which your podcast will kind of live. And if you produce several podcasts, of course, then you'll need them to be curated, right? So you'll have several of your podcasts together. And so those are the topics we're going to look at within this session. So when we're looking at podcasts, a podcast, as it reads here, are basically their audio files or audio recordings, very similar to radio. And, if you were in one of my classes in communication, we talk about the history of radio and where it's gone, but we're not. But what's the fascinating thing about radio is that since it's all digital, this is just kind of another form. It's where the medium of radio, which is totally audio, has gone. And so radio shows, as we know, are very versatile when we talk about, communication and media, because it's something that you could listen to while you're out walking, while you're exercising, or like me, while I'm cooking dinner. So you can download, a podcast, or you can listen to it live. There's different ways in which you can do that. So it's very versatile. So it kind of speaks to what it is, but also the why. Podcasts have a very similar structure to talk shows usually. Some have, very basic production values where it's just someone talking, maybe a singular person, or there's an interview going on. And then there are some that have production values that are very similar to high-end talk shows on the radio, where you'll have music edited in, sound effects, that type of thing. And then podcasts are delivered usually in episodes, and people can subscribe to them to get the latest versions. And that's usually on your hosting site, where folks can subscribe, and then they're notified that, hey, there's a new podcast that was just uploaded. And, it keeps things very fresh and exciting. So your podcasts are delivered in episodes, and episodes are as long or as short as you like. That's one of the things you should begin to think about, Do I want a 10-minute episode? Do I want 15-minute episodes? Do I want 20 to 30-minute episodes? And if you think about, again, the versatility and how a podcast is used, someone might, exercise while listening to your podcast. Someone might be out driving and listening to your podcast. You want to think about that in terms of your audience, like, what are their time constraints, or how you might imagine or want your listeners to hear the podcast and in what type of episodic formats. And then we get to the why. Again, kind of the what speaks to the why. It's portable, very flexible type of medium. It's low production costs because we're going to talk about, again, like what's the lower end of producing a podcast, but you can always bump it up. You can always bump it up a notch and have it, where you have this more high end production values part of it. But for the most part, they're pretty easy to make. Your podcast on the lower end, you can produce it with your smartphone. You can utilize your computer and Zooming. So that keeps the costs down. And then it can be discovered by people in places that, go to iTunes for their music, but many people also go to iTunes for their podcasts or audiobooks. And then places like Spotify, which are also folks go to for music, or they go to for other multimedia, but mainly audio. So these are spots on the internet where folks frequent, and you could do a Google search. Let's say you're looking for content, just plain content that speaks to education around the world. Or like me, I'm looking for, shows on history or something like that. I do a Google search. It will most likely take me to iTunes or Spotify, where podcasts are stored and archived. When you start to build your podcast, you first need to really think about, what's going to be your theme, what's going to be your topic. And, a good place to start, what are you passionate about? What drives you? What is your interest? Because if it's really something that you are deeply interested in and you're able to communicate that to an audience, folks are going to listen to your podcast. There's podcasts on pet care. There's a podcast on child care. There's podcasts on gardening. Everything under the sun. It's as extensive and as diverse as people are with their interests and their hobbies. There's a podcast for it. So you want to, when you're trying to figure out what your podcast will be about, right? Again, pick something that you're going to stay interested in, and most likely your audience will be interested as well. You want to also look at what's your goal for your podcast. Sometimes I actually interviewed podcasters, and one of the things when I talk about, well, what's your purpose? What's your goal? Sometimes they want to reach a certain number of listeners. And after they reach a certain number of listeners, they go on to create another podcast because they're really just interested in, trying to reach a goal, see if they could do it, have a million listeners, and it can be done. So the other thing you need to look at is, what do you want to communicate? So it's not enough that you're passionate about a particular topic. What do you want to say about it? Like, do you have something to say about gardening? Maybe you're a person that gardens and you only want to talk about, vegetable gardens, or you only want to talk about certain flowers that you particularly like, Well, again, you have to figure out, what do you want to communicate? Because if you can figure that out, you have like a kind of a niche or a particular thing to say that folks might find interesting, and it might be informative, right, for your listeners. And then the other thing when you're evaluating your goals, who's the audience? So if you're thinking about these particular niche areas, on gardening, on food, on foodways, let's say, food and culture, that who's your audience? Is it an international audience? Is it global? Is it a regional audience, perhaps? I live in Western Massachusetts. The shows that I do a video show and a podcast. I'm looking at Western Massachusetts and small towns because those are the folks I want to reach. So it's really important to try to figure out who's your audience, because oftentimes that'll also determine your goals and your topics. So then you want to establish a focus. So this has to do with looking at your goals, right? And trying to figure out what you're passionate about. You don't want your topics to be so broad. If, let's say, you have a very broad topic like gardening, as I said before, what about gardening? There's lots of different podcasts on gardening. But let's say you're focused on butternut squash and you have like lots of knowledge about how to grow butternut squash. Then it becomes something when people Google it, it's like, I'm going to that podcast on butternut squash. Now that might be just too narrow. Maybe squash grown in the Northeast might be just general enough, but a bit more narrow that folks will listen in. Because again, if you make it too general, then you're all over the place. So you try to go somewhere in the middle and particularly provide information that's not available anywhere else, perhaps. So narrow your topic so that you stand out. And decide what really sets you apart from other podcasts, right? Providing people, again, information that they might not get anywhere else, or they might not get it anywhere else, but also from your particular vantage point or point of view, which is really important when you talk about narrowing your focus. And then you want to consider having some guests. If, you're a talker, it might be great to listen for a while. But then if you bring in guests who are perhaps experts in their field, going back to gardening, someone who is an expert gardener looking at squash and maybe the pests that tend to eat the squash or what have you. You can bring in a guest. They're an expert in that area. Folks will listen in. It's informative, but it's also really engaging if you have someone where you can have a conversation. And so having guests is a great way to keep your podcast fresh and informative. So I always say, look for the convenient sample. And the convenient sample is oftentimes my friends. And it's a great way to, extend these conversations with your friends. But your friends are also, once you have a conversation with them, you find out they're experts in different areas that you didn't know. So they're interesting, right? So bring in people who might know something different. So as you're thinking about your focus, your goals, all of those things, you might want to spend some time doing some research on your ideas around what's a good podcast. And so here are my favorites that I wanted to share with you, and maybe you'll look at some of them, not only for the content, but the production quality. And so here I have The Mom and Dad Are Fighting, which is hosted through Slate. And this is a really interesting one in terms of content because I am a mom. But I also like the production values on this one. And it's hosted on Apple Podcasts. Then here's one through Google Podcasts, which is when we get to the idea of what's more economical, it's a really economical choice to host it here and have it curated. But as I said, I like history. And so this one is Latin American History Podcast. And here's one of the episodes. And you can see the time. This is a rather long one. And then you can see the description. And this will be required for all of the podcasts in terms of hosting. You'll have to have a title, the name of your podcast, the episode name. This will usually register once you load it, like what's the time frame. But then you'll have to have a description, or you should have a description. And it's always good to have a really compelling, interesting description, include your guest, etc. Here's another one that's really entertaining. I teach about film and representation. So this one, Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood, is really funny and very lively. And so I like that one. This is probably my all-time favorite, however, and we're going to talk a little bit about what she does. This is actually her website, Laura Collins Lister Mensch, and she is an author, and she's also an advocate on food and eating disorders. So she has done 3 different podcasts in her lifetime, and this latest one is really fascinating, and it's based on one of her short novels that she wrote. So I just wanted to show you here that she has her own website where she also curates not only her books, but her podcast. So here are Laura's, this is her latest podcast called the Alton Laughing Club. As I said, it's based on a short novel that she did. And what's interesting about it is that, and what makes it my favorite, is that she talks about race and the tensions to do with, race within the U.S., but it's always done in a way that is engaging. Her book was a satiric book based on a small town in North Carolina where people kind of clash with the historical realities of racial injustice and how that small town is now getting gentrified. And so it's a really interesting book, but she interspersed the reading of the chapters with actual discussions and interviews with people, not only in North Carolina, the small town that she's talking about, but all over, having to do with, trying to figure out this thing that we have in the U.S. around racial injustice. And she started it this summer in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And she has continued this podcast. And not only is the content compelling, right, and engaging, but how she has it set up and is hosted is really nicely done. She has Listen Notes, which is, again, a hosting site, obviously Apple Podcasts. This is one called Odyssey, and then Spotify, and then Podtail. So she's all over the place. She's very easy to find. And it's a really, really good example of how to bump it up a notch when you're talking about podcasting. So what do you need? Well, I'm going to try to talk about what you need kind of on the lower end. That's the great thing about podcasting. You could do it with very little equipment, but you do need some equipment. And then if you want to bump up the production values a bit, I'll show you what you can do on the higher end. So we have this fine gentleman sitting here just to kind of explain what he has. Of course, he has his computer. He has, this is an arm that actually screws onto the desk here, which is very handy for the microphone. because you don't want your microphone resting on a desk or resting somewhere where it could be bumped, because microphones are very sensitive and it'll pick up that on your recording. He also has a screen here, this shield, that helps when you're doing a podcast to take out the B's and the P's, and it pops when we talk. We don't notice it, but it actually is picked up by the microphone. And of course, he has the other piece of equipment, which is the headphones. This is something that if you were continuing to do podcasting and you wanted to go into the higher end, this is what's called a field recorder. And you can put a microphone using your XLR cables, and you would put this on a rack like how the gentleman had, so that it's not disturbed. But then you could also use this because these are two microphones here. And so you could also use this as a microphone. What's important about that, if you continue to do podcasting and you really want to bump it up a notch, the quality of the sound is much better and sharper through that. The other thing you could do is get a DSLR camera such as this. And what's important about this particular DSLR camera is that it has a space in which you can plug in an external mic, because DSLR cameras, although they're wonderful and they give you lots of light and color, they right now do not have very good microphones. And so you would mount this on a tripod and you would have your interviews, you would do your own type of, conversation. But this is basically what you'd have in a kit for your podcasting. And then lastly, you would, of course, have your headphones. This is important because what you're hearing, or you're not really hearing it while you're taping or recording your podcast, you can hear everything and to see if it's sharp, see if there's anything, background noise, that type of thing. Again, that just boosts up the production values. You could also just use earbuds. So lastly, on this slide, you'll see that I have Zoom. That means the Zoom software that you would have on your computer, because you can take that Zoom video and you can strip the video part of it and keep the audio and use it for your podcast. Or you could do what's called a vlog, which is a video kind of blog, and it's just a video podcast. You could certainly use it that way as well. And then lastly, you want to make sure you have some editing software. As you try to get your recording as perfect as you can, but there's always some different issues. Maybe there's some silences that are within your recording. Maybe there's some background noise. Maybe you stopped and started, or as earlier, my microphone fell off in my demonstration and you want to edit that out. So here, I'm going to talk a lot about Apple computers as the example, simply because I use a Mac. But I want to make sure for those of you who are also Windows users have the same type of facility and have the same type of knowledge, because you can use either or. Now, there will most likely be those that will say, no, Windows is better to do podcastings, or Mac or Apple is better to do podcasting. I'm not going to jump into that fight, but I do want you to have the knowledge. So this website actually is a really good place to start. It will give you what you'll need in terms of software, what you'll also need in terms of hardware. And when I say hardware in this instance, I'm talking about on your computer, in order to be able to do a podcast, because you'll need a certain amount of memory on your computer. You'll need a certain amount of speed on your computer. And like I said, other software that you'll need in order to get started. So microphones, pretty important. Here are some different choices. I already showed you a couple of choices that I have in my toolkit. But the one here, this is one that plugs into your computer. It has the stereo connector that plugs into the headphone area. It also has 2 mics. So let's say someone is actually in person with you, you can have that interview happen. Otherwise, you are doing this through Zoom. Same thing, your headphones. This is actually a kit you can purchase where everything comes together. And just real quick about the mics, they use something that's called an XLR, and I showed you that on the recorder earlier. And your field recorder, which I showed earlier, that is an external interface. So these are things that you may want to look up if you have to go on Amazon to purchase something, or you have to go to my favorite place, which is B&H. These are questions most likely that they'll ask if you're trying to purchase an external mic. So these are examples of the field recorders. There's a lower end one, which works extremely well, and the sound pickup is very sharp, and it's under $100. Really good purchase there. And then, of course, you can boost it up and get this one that's a little under $300. So these are the other things that you'll need. Software is really important. Download and keep your Zoom software, your Zoom package up to date. Oftentimes you get onto a Zoom and it says, oh, I need to update. So before you even start recording for your podcast using Zoom, make sure your Zoom software is up to date so that won't occur. Then if you have a smartphone, particularly some of these latest versions of smartphones, they are, the cameras on them are high tech, right? So I know that the Apple phone, the iPhone has like 3 different cameras that come with it now. So you can, in essence, mount it on a tripod, and you can use your iPhone or, your Samsung phone to do a podcast and to do interviews. So these are all really good options. And then, of course, your DSLR camera that I showed earlier, or your Zoom field recorder. The video or DSLR camera it's digital single lens reflex camera. And these are cameras that we normally, or we often think of as something for a still photo. But we know now in the last 5 to 6 years, these cameras have become video cameras, and they let in a lot of light. They let in a lot of, in terms of, depth. And so they're a great option if you can utilize one to do your podcast. The only thing is that you need to, again, make sure that you have an external mic. And what's really cool about it is that your external mic simply attaches on the side. And it's going to take too much time to show you all that. But these are things that would come in, basically if you were to set up a podcasting type of kit. You'd have this, and you'd have your tripod, and you'd have your headphones, and you would be ready to go. So in editing, you're going to need some audio software, whether you're on a Windows-based computer or you're on a Mac computer. GarageBand comes with a Mac usually, and then Audacity, that's free on the internet. You can also put Audacity onto a Mac. Audacity is great because it's really easy to use. It doesn't have a lot of extraneous type of menus that you have to figure out. So it's a really great option. If you want to bump it up, Adobe Audition, I'd recommend for right now the trial version, but it's one that you would have to pay for. Hindenburg as well, which is really great. Hindenburg is a wonderful option if you're talking about really doing lots of interviews. It's used often actually in radio, and it also has a trial version. So there's lots to talk about in terms of audio software. And in our next session, I'll do a quick demonstration using GarageBand and Audacity so you can see how it works. The other thing that you really should begin investigating are your hosting sites, because you're going to have to figure out a way in which to archive and curate your podcasts, because I'm going to be hopeful you're going to have several different podcasts and different episodes, and you want to make them easy to find. You want to make them, also available in many different ways. So folks that have Google, folks that have iTunes, make them available through social media, that type of thing. And so you should begin researching what are some good hosting sites, and particularly ones that are either free or don't cost an arm and a leg, because usually they charge monthly or by year. And you want to kind of look at, well, what can I afford for these different sites? The other thing about hosting sites, you want to make sure it's a hosting site that has some longevity. Oftentimes they'll have hosting sites that, folks set up, business people set up, and then folks pay for them, and then they're gone. And so you want to actually research what is a good and reliable hosting site for your podcast. The free podcast hosting platforms, this is a place where you can check out a bunch of free ones. Most of them, however, that they're talking about have a trial version set up. So just be aware of that. So here are some free or trial versions that I've checked out. The two where my name, D. Shabazz, is already inscribed there are the two that did not require a credit card or money up front. And so you can kind of, experiment to see which one's easiest in terms of upload, which one's easiest in terms of like folks finding it through a search engine, that type of thing. So Podbean was a really good one, and Buzzsprout I really liked. And so I actually continue to talk about Buzzsprout in the next slide. So Buzzsprout was really cool because I was able to do several different things with relative ease. One, they give you 2 hours of content and 29 days in which you have access to it. So if you're talking about a relatively small project of podcasts, this might be a really great option. The other thing that it allowed me to do is kind of customize different things. As you could tell, I was able to change the color background so that you can customize the site. It's almost like having your own website that you're curating for your podcast. So this, again, might be a really good option. Not all of them allow for that. So I was also able to put a background image onto the podcast site. And what was nice about that, the podcast will focus on a show that I produce with my husband, the other Dr. Shabazz, called Difficult Dialogues. And so here's our photo Actually, sandwiched in the middle there is the previous host of Difficult Dialogues we took the show over from. And so you're able to, again, kind of personalize this. And as you could see, they have a selection within their menu for websites. They also provide social media links, etc. So like I said, you could really personalize this. And then lastly, if you again are interested in continuing with podcasting, you could always monetize it and figure out ways in which to make money through your podcast. So here it was relatively easy for me to upload. In the second part of the introduction to podcasting, I'll actually show you how to finalize this and upload. But as you could see, they're asking simply for the episode title. This is the description, as I explained earlier. And for right now, it's left unpublished, but you can publish immediately. So right when you finish, you can load it. It's ready to go. Or what's great is that, let's say you, within a week, complete several different podcasts. You can put them onto your site here, your hosting site, and then you can schedule them either one at a time or schedule all together for them to publish and be available through the internet. So that's really a nice way to do it. And here you see the episode that I loaded, and it says I'll have this for 90 days for my free account, which again is one of the reasons why I opted to have this one as well. It's a really cool website. And then lastly, you want your podcast to be seen by as many people, hopefully, as possible. You want to share what you're passionate about. You want to share what you know, right? So you put your social media within all of the hosting websites have this type of option. But again, I like this one because it was very easy to do. I simply cut and pasted the links for each one of these. I have a Facebook page, I have a YouTube page for Difficult Dialogue, so it all corresponds. And then, as you could see here, my podcast with the picture, although awkwardly placed, is there as well. So on our next introduction to podcasting, we will look at how to actually make this happen, and then how to publish it, how to upload it to the host site. And I'll walk you through all of that on our next time together. Thank you.